So with that, let's go. When we chose this title, I'm mindful of the word siege. We weren't trying to be opportunistic. We set up to do this event a few months ago, and so I'm mindful of the choice of words there. And yet at the same time, there is a reality that crises in the world, volatility, do drive up cybercrime. There's a study that I haven't got into the nuts and bolts of, but essentially this research team looked at the number of mentions of cybercrime or attacks or threats on the earnings call of publicly listed companies. I think it's in the US, the study, and what you can see is although it tracks incidences of cybercrime, that is the number of calls that mentioned, the number of earnings and analyst calls by public companies that mentioned a selection of language pertaining to cybercrime, it does outpace it at certain times. And so I think when you have volatility like in the world today, you do see an increase in attacks. My wife showed me a message from the CTO of her company. She works for a British company in Sydney, but they've got about 18 offices around the world. And the CTO sent a message a week ago, which I thought was appropriate, saying, with all the all the awful things going on in Europe, you do tend to see a knock-on effect around cybercrime activity and payments fraud and so on. So it is a time to be vigilant. How we're going to do today is I'm going to start with just a little bit of contextual information, just to set the scene for a few minutes. I'm then going to talk about how we see at FCHR the drivers of payments fraud, and that's a point I'll make up front, that cybercrime is a broad church of malicious activity. The area that we're expert in or can remedy and focus on is payments fraud. It's a rapidly growing area of fraud, and I guess for us, cybercrime is about data threats to your business. I mean, it's more than that, but we're defined as data threats to your business, and we're focused on the end at which data threats become commercial threats or commercial losses, which is payments fraud. I'm then going to look at two common types of payments fraud. The one we see most prevalent in Australia, and according to a whole lot of FBI reports from the US, the fastest growing in the US too, which is business email compromise or vendor email compromise, or sometimes called payment diversion fraud, and its cousin, executive fraud. I'm then going to look at a very specific case study that happened here in Sydney now about 14 months ago, pertaining to Levitas Capital, and I've called it a bit dramatically Zoom to Doom in a click. And then lastly, we'll just talk about some solutions. We're not here to sell FCHR. We do have a very innovative conceptual way of addressing this problem. So I'm going to talk about what we've done in terms of a conceptual solution, and then we'll close off and have time for questions. And I hope you get some value. So let's just start with some context. So a few months after I joined FCHR, there was this story. In fact, I think it was 2 years after I joined, but there was a story that got a lot of traction in the global press, including here in Australia, and it was pertinent because they asked our CFO, CEO, our colleague Mike Kontorovich, bottom left-hand corner, to comment. Channel 7 did, and the story was about how this individual with maybe one or two accomplices, that was it, the man in the top right of your screen, Evaldis Rumisauskas, managed to scam Google and Facebook collectively out of about 186 million US dollars. So this man and one or two accomplices managed to defraud two of the most powerful technology companies on earth out of 186 million dollars. And he did it through largely a business email compromise attack, where he impersonated being one of the hardware suppliers. He set up a subsidiary of one of the Taiwanese hardware suppliers in Europe, and he got through all Google and Facebook's payment controls and to a degree, I guess, sort of cyber controls, for lack of a better term, and he managed to defraud them. Now, it took them 5 or 6 years to catch him and eventually prosecute him. So they did get him, but I don't know if the money was recovered, and the loss was the loss. And what we often see with these scams is the loss isn't the dollars lost. There's like a 3 or 4x is a number I've heard from KPMG, a 4x loss when you add on legal costs, downtime of systems, distress of staff, never mind reputational damage. And what I'd just start as a question that I'd like to put to all of you today is, if Google and Facebook were rendered vulnerable by one individual, or let's say one individual and two accomplices, where does that leave all of us. Where does that leave you and your organization? If you fast forward a few years, this was a really distressing story that was covered nationally, but I've just picked up the Fin Review's take on it, where, and this is the case study I'm going to go into, where really a click on a fake Zoom invite had massive, if not existential consequences for Levitas Capital, a hedge fund in Sydney. But I'll loop back to that. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, every few weeks, never mind days, I could probably up. Ahead of that. But the number we like to think about, and I'd like you to think about, is a far more innocent one, which is this number. And the reason why we focus on this number is said best by Brad Smith, who was Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft, where he says every company has at least one employee who will click on anything once. And then we at FCHR modify that statement in two ways. The first way is we'd say every company has at least one employee who will click on anything once, because it just takes a single click. And then the second way we modify that statement is as follows. Every company has at least one supplier with one employee who will click on anything once. And I would argue that that is the crux issue, certainly, if not at the coalface of modern cybercrime, certainly at the modern coalface of payments fraud and paying the wrong people, which is, it's not about you and your system. I mean, that's important, and there are a multitude of solutions, and there are people who are more expert in the broader realm of cybersecurity from a technology infrastructure point of view. It's not about protecting your system, although you should. It's also not good enough to just ensure your staff behavior, hygiene, discipline around security, passwords, their use of applications and hardware and software is good. Yeah.
Sorry, Gavin, may I interrupt you real quick?
Sure.
Some people are experiencing audio problems, and it cut out for me as well for a little bit.
Okay, that's fine. What I'm going to do is just remove my microphone. At what point did it cut out, Nick?
It cut out 3 slides ago, and other people are still experiencing it now. I can hear you, but other people have sound issues now. So I think it's a hardware.
Everyone can hear me now. Okay. I hope everyone can hear me now. I've removed my microphone, so hopefully that'll help.
I see some messages now that it's back. So
okay, great. So I've just sorry everyone, I've just gone back a slide or two, and what we were saying is there's a sea of statistics, but they largely, they're numbing. What's more important is this number 1, which is because every company has at least one employee who will click on anything. And then I said at FCHR, we modify it in 2 ways. We say you just need to click on anything once, but more importantly, every company has at least one supplier with an employee who will click on anything. And this is where we were, which was, it's not about you and your system and the integrity of that, albeit important. It's not about the behavior of your staff, albeit also crucially important. The modern conundrum for a business watching its payments is what happens in your community or ecosystem of suppliers if one of them is duped by a fraudster who gets authentically into their email system, sends you a manipulated invoice or any other form of financial communication, and you pay someone you think you're paying, but you're actually paying the wrong person. And that's the fastest growing version of cybercrime, payments fraud, which is business email compromise, payment diversion scams. And these scams are more psychology than technology. And that's what we're here to talk about today, which is, I think, should be front and center for most CFOs or financial leaders, or in larger organizations, AP leaders. So that's what we're going to come back to. But I think where this takes me is to really the causes, which is the next part of our presentation, and what's driving the problem. Well, I guess one sort of leg of the stool, one driver is certainly this architectural flaw in the Australian banking system, but I could replace Australian with any other number of jurisdictions or markets, where the banking system, which had rapidly evolved from a pre-digital kind of, let's say, 50s, 60s, 70s era to a kind of rapid digitization, And the net is that the banking system struggles to match, and it cannot match BSB and account numbers to account names. And when we used to first go speak to customers, as recently as I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, this was news. Today, I hope in this audience, it's no longer news. But nevertheless, it's a gap that hasn't been plugged. At some point later on, if we want to talk about things like NPP or what the British call COP and so on, there are sort of movements to try plug that gap and create a matching system in the banks, but they tend to not work and be incomplete. And certainly we seem a long way from that in Australia. But not only does that gap exist, but the banks disclaim responsibility and they'll tell you as much on their websites. So that's a kind of a cornerstone of it. And then there's these other sort of legs to the stool. And the other one I'd say is ease of identity fraud. I should have stuck that. I don't know how many people have seen that deep fake video of Tom Cruise running around where it really looks like Tom Cruise, but it's just deep fakery, which is it's him created in software. And today you don't even have to impersonate video. You just have to impersonate words and imagery and logos and text, and you can defraud someone. So, you know, identity theft is easy, and it's going to get easier. I don't need to talk to this audience about being in a digitally connected supply chain. I'm sure most of us in our private and personal lives are increasingly transformed and having to live and work with more digital technology, which has efficiency and workflow upsides, but verification, identity, and legitimacy downsides. And lastly, you've got email, which, you know, so much of our business, especially in the financial realm and in the payments realm, still exists with email or is allied in some way to email. And email, I want to make up a bit of time, so I'm not going to get stuck down here, but email is a spectacularly vulnerable system. Doesn't matter if you're on a Google platform or Microsoft, or email tends to be hugely penetrable, okay? And I remember this article from a while ago, which was, you can read about these failures, these global failures in certain applications. Like this was a Microsoft Outlook server issue. I think it was at the end of 2020. I'm open to correction. I can't see the, March of 21. And you can read it and distance yourself from it. But what actually happens is, in this case, I think there were millions of email addresses and emails that were compromised. And even if it's in another jurisdiction to you, are you a recipient of one of those? Did you send to one of those companies where there was this lack of a patch in a Microsoft in Microsoft Mail? And it can very quickly become a problem for you, even if you're operating in another industry or business. So those are kind of 4 of the drivers that are driving this payments fraud growth. But there's a 5th thing, and I'd ask us all to reflect a bit at this moment, which is, we know that ERP, accounting software, vendor management software, invoicing software, or the stack with which you're looking at your payments has improved workflow. And I also know it's improved controls to a degree. But so often when we speak to businesses, be they medium, SMBs, or all the way up to listed enterprise businesses, we find manual moments of control, especially in payment controls. You find a manual moment where someone is checking someone. And even if someone is not checking someone, most systems require data input, and often there is human input to get that data into the system, which means the system is always only as good as its operators, its human operators. So when you take all this technology, all the same technology we use, hackers use, all the same technology we use, cyber criminals use, and you run it into manual moments of control, you can get errors. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, I've got a great AP team, and I don't dispute that for 1 second. But can they be perfect? And can they be perfect at volume and at tempo and under distress? So, it's a question, and it leads me to my next point, which is often the controls you think are in place are not quite there. And, your auditor would be saying to you, are you doing callback controls? They certainly should. So, when you add or change vendors, are you doing callback controls? But even something like a callback control, it needs to be done in a highly disciplined way. And I'm going to stop here because we often get asked this. Like, we've seen AP people, they'll do a callback control, but 1 in 10, they don't independently source the number. If you don't independently source the number, everything's rendered useless. The other interesting thing about callbacks is, and there's a lot of nuances to it. People can do a callback to verify a vendor, but they'll ask the vendor, is this your bank account 54321, whatever, and that also is a fail. Shared office space and messaging. If you leave a message with a receptionist at a shared office space, I'm just picking these marginal examples, and they turn it into email, then even though you did a call, it's become email. And then vendor management system, there are also gaps in those, because we've seen Trojans get in and malware get in and manipulate data in vendor management systems. So if I had to summarize this kind of problem set, for us, it's a question of identity. And I guess this is, this is the challenge of what some people call Web 3, as opposed to Web 1, Web 2. But this new era, this era we're in and the era we're going to, it's really a question of identity. Like, we don't know who's on the other side of the computer when we're communicating. We don't know who's on the other side of the computer when we're working. So how can we know who we're paying? And then along comes COVID, which has just amplified all that. It's send finance teams home. It's send IT teams home. I'm actually speaking to you from my home. I'm sure the IT environment here is not quite as secure. In fact, I know it's not to be nearly as secure as our office. And yes, I'm just doing a webinar in the public domain, but what about finance teams or accounts teams, AP teams? Where are they working from, and where they're working from at any moment in time? This was summed up for us. We're at a meeting with PwC, our partner, at a big business, and the CFO said, that's not him, by the way, but the CFO said, I just paid $1 million from my kitchen table, and that kind of sums it up. This was in the first 8 months of COVID, but I've never forgot it. So the problem, the drivers, as I see it, looks like that. We've got the banks that don't match. We've got vulnerable email systems. We've got ease of identity theft. We've got the fact that ERP is, in upgrades and does digitally transform the enterprise and finance, but it's imperfect. It is isolated. It can't check against anything other than itself. And they run into manual controls. Along came sort of hybrid work, and you get this uptick in payments fraud. So that's a good time to kind of step into some of these scams. And you might be familiar, some of you might be familiar with the mechanics of these scams, but there's often interesting nuances that I can touch on, and often the kind of the devil's in the details. So we don't have time today to go through all of these, but I'm gonna just touch on really the first two, which is the most common that we've seen, fastest growing both locally and abroad, which is supply or business email compromise, executive fraud, which is a variation on that theme. I'm sure there's some of you nodding. We see these executive fraud driven emails all the time. Sometimes we get targeted. In fact, as recently as Monday, I saw an email purporting to be from one of our founders to a junior member of staff, and these things will be very common, especially in more complex management structures, bigger companies. And then the last two are nefarious employee, which is our word for an insider scam, and with apologies to the late great George Michael, a careless whisper, which is really about password hygiene. I'm really just going to go through the first one today, talk about the second. We won't have time to cover the other two, but maybe we can do that in a following webinar. Or there's content on our site that pertains to that. So all those scams really are about change in information and details, leads to wrong payment, leads to a loss to the business, and an extremely difficult recovery. There's a great KPMG banking industry study. It's now, I think, about 2 years old, but it said something like 25% of bankers who were in the survey said that only half of the victims of cybercrime ever got more than a quarter of the funds back, and that was, I think, 4,000 different bankers and covered 13 big institutions in the APAC region. Sorry, I know that was a bit of a convoluted argument, but it's very difficult to recover your money. Sometimes you can, often you can't. So the recovery is difficult. And what I'll repeat is the financial loss is not the full loss. The full loss is often a 3 or 4x. So with that in mind, let's step through the first scam, which is a supply email compromise. I think the knowledge of the mechanics of these scams has become better over the years, so I'm going to move quite quickly, and I'm just watching our time. So let's say you got a fraudster, and just a sidebar here is a fraudster is not a teenager in a hoodie in a garage anymore, despite what Hollywood sometimes wants us to believe. They tend to be organizations, syndicates. They operate from all over the world, often Eastern Europe, China gets like tagged, But Peter Price, CEO of Crime Stoppers, said to me that still the largest export of cybercrime is the US. It does get complicated when you remove state-sponsored cybercrime and stuff. But nevertheless, from all over the world, you've got fraud syndicates. Think of them more like organizations with highly skilled employees, and I'm doing little inverted commas, but employees who are trained, skilled. They've got the full resources of any private company, and they want to target a business like AutoWorks, which is a notional business I've made up in the auto industry. Now, in the old days, they might send a virus into AutoWorks, malware, they might worms, DDoS attacks, all these attacks, they might do those. But more common what we see is today, if a fraudster wants to get into AutoWorks, it's better to do it by way of their supply set. So what they'll do is they will either do some research, or they will monitor, or they will, they could do a mass phishing attack and then work out who clicks and are they suppliers of a company. But in my example here, let's say they do some research, they work out who AutoWorks' suppliers are, and they send a whole lot of phishing emails to those suppliers. And these are the ones that unfortunately pop up in our inbox each and every day. Often known brands will be used, whether it's Microsoft, Dropbox, sometimes government institutions. I could go through a litany of examples that we've got, but I've just picked those two. And these are a bit antiquated, but they get increasingly sophisticated, these phishing emails. And what will happen is the goal of the phishing email is to just get that one click once from a supplier of AutoWorks. And in my example here, let's say an accounts receivable leader, or the CFO or the FD of Tireco, a supplier to AutoWorks, he's not concentrating, his spam filter doesn't pick it up, and he clicks. And when he clicks, he sends his details, or the click will likely take him to a phishing site. Okay, and here I've picked one. This is a real phishing site. Again, each month, day, year, the sophistication of these phishing tools improves. But let's say he clicks, and he then hands his credentials to the fraudster, and now the fraudster has Dave's login. Now, it could be Dave's login to his email system. It could be worse than that, because if Dave uses similar login credentials from his email to his actual ERP, then the fraudster can get into the ERP. But nevertheless, let's say the fraudster gets into his email. That's all he needs to get into. Gets into Dave's email, and now the fraudster can do a couple of things. The one thing the fraudster can do is just manipulate an invoice, or the fraudster can put some monitoring spyware in there to look at exchanges between AutoWorks and David Tireco, and at the appropriate time issue an email saying we've changed our bank details. That's actually what we see more often than sort of photoshopped invoices. Now, here's a little nuance. What we've seen happen is the fraudster knows that AutoWorks might have a disciplined AP team doing callbacks and so forth. So what we've seen a fraudster do is call ahead. Call ahead to AutoWorks, say, hey, we have changed our bank details. Don't be alarmed when you see them. Okay. Next thing that happens is, let's say AutoWorks are still a bit suspicious, and they email David Tireco back just to double check they have in fact changed their details. Well, what we've seen happen is, and often the case, Dave never gets the email, because the first thing the fraudsters have done is put filter software in. They're monitoring the software, they're filtering, they're looking for certain semantic terms. They see something like a query, and they respond as Dave, doubling down on the change of bank details. AutoWorks pay, and the money goes to the fraudster. Something to also note is, even if AutoWorks do a callback, on occasion we've seen phone numbers be ported. So the actual callback goes to the fraudster. So that's a classic email compromise, a supply email compromise. Executive fraud is a variation on this, where instead of the fraudster impersonating a supplier, the fraudster will impersonate a senior executive in the company, often instructing a junior person in the company to make a payment to a certain business. There's a lot of nuance to how these happen. A couple of examples. Often on a Friday afternoon, you'll see attempts to do these kind of scams because people are in a rush and want to get home, certainly pre-COVID, or want to get off their work computers. Sometimes when people are traveling, they'll do it. We've seen examples where the fraudsters have used even certain slang and turns of phrase that the person being impersonated uses. And that's because they monitor before they execute. Sometimes they'll monitor for minutes, hours, days, months, whatever, but it's really nuanced and sinister, these scams. So that's an executive fraud. What I said I'd do earlier on is step through an example. This this one, which I mentioned earlier. What's really interesting about this one is it really shows how nuanced these attacks can be, how well researched the fraudsters are, and it's somewhere between a supplier email compromise and an executive fraud. So with that, I'm going to go through it. So let me just introduce the players. There was a fraud syndicate we don't know where they were from. We don't know how well resourced they were, but what we do know is they understood the relationship between their target, their victim, Levitas Capital, being a fund, and its trustees, which was AT Corporate Trust, and Apex, which was the fund administrator. So they knew that relationship and that sort of organizational structure around payments, authorization, and so forth. So that's on the victim side of the fence. On the perpetrator side of the fence, what the fraudster did was they set up two companies, something called Unique Star Trading in Sydney, and then a second business, Pavilion Limited, in Hong Kong. And what I'll tell you later, they actually set up a third business in Singapore, all for the purposes of committing the fraud. Then what they did was they did their first step, which was the fake Zoom invite. And they sent a Zoom invite to the principal of Levitas Capital, a guy called Michael Fagan. They might have sent it to more people in the organization, but Fagan was the one that clicked. And basically, I don't know if it looked like this, but it might have. This is a malicious Zoom invite, but it could have been a variation on this. And that was the first step. When Fagan clicks, they get into his email system. Okay, so they're in and they're monitoring, and they've put some sort of malware or spyware in. Sometimes just a click on the wrong email will send the malware into your system. So that happens. They then move to the next phase. And the next phase is also, what's the word, shrewd, or I don't want to glorify the crime here, but it's an act of shrewdness and diligence. And what they do is they know Levitas Capital is an investor who makes investments in investee companies. So they don't send an invoice, they send, and I've never obviously seen the document, but it's a capital call document calling for the investment that was allegedly promised by Levitas Capital to Unique Star Trading. Now what they do is they don't send it to the principal, being Levitas Capital, they send it to the trustee. I'm not sure if they sent it to the trustee or the administrator, but it appears from the reporting was sent to the trustee. And they knew that and this was for $1.2 million. So clearly they're calling for the capital promised as investment. They knew that the trustee would need to get authorization from Levitas Capital. It's worth pausing at this point though and kind of going, well, how did they get into the vendor master file? How did Unique Star Trading get legitimately into anyone's vendor master file or supplier list or system to even be considered a vendor? Don't know what the answer to that is, but nevertheless, what we do know is that the fraudsters knew the trustees would need to get payment approval from Levitas Capital. And so what happened was they phoned, the trustees did phone Fagan to get approval. Apparently he was at the gym or he didn't get the message. So what happens was they email him. Now, as per my example early on, the fraudsters were in his email and they're monitoring. So Fagan would have never got the email query, nor if he had got it and responded would have the trustees got it. Maybe Fagan responded, said, do not pay, because the fraudsters were in with their filters. And what they would have done is doubled down, purported to be Fagan, authorized the payment, and $1.2 million was paid to Unique Star Trading. Instantly, that $1.2 million was transferred from ANZ in Sydney to a series of branches in Queensland, of which $780,000 was withdrawn by a member of the syndicate who got on a plane and left the country. Okay, and that money was gone. Bizarrely, they repeated the scam with a different a different malicious company called Pavilion, where a transaction was done for 2.5 million using the same kind of methodology, and a third transaction, believe it or not, to East Grand Trading in Singapore. Now, somewhere between Levitas and AT Corporate Trust, they realized what was going on. They stopped a whole lot of the transactions, and they recovered, I think, 7 of the 8 million that was transferred, but not $1 million, and that was gone. And at the time the story was reported, the big problem was Australian Catholic Super, who I think were going to make a big investment into Levitas, pulled their investment, which was hugely problematic for Levitas. So that's an example of how nuanced these scams are. How do you solve the problem? What do you do about it? Especially when some of the things that you have in place might not be right. And our solution or our view of the suite of response should look something like this. It's very important. It's easy to call awareness and culture the soft stuff, but the soft stuff, as you know, can have very hard knocks. You need to be aware. I want to talk a little bit about culture. If you've got a culture in your team or your business where people are wary to ask questions for fear of embarrassment or looking bad, that's good if you're for the fraudsters, because you need that moment where even a junior person can come to the most senior person and say, I'm not sure if I should click on this, or I'm not sure if I should respond to this. Or you need a culture which welcomes questioning. Then you need awareness. You need as much. It's a moving feast. Unfortunately, it changes all the time. So you need awareness of these scams. Sessions like this are good, but there are other businesses and resources available. These Nick mentioned earlier on some of ours. So if you go to our website, we've got some really good guides. Some are just one-page checklists. Some are make for better nighttime reading. We do weekly updates. We publish the latest scams, but there's some other great resources which are hugely which are excellent. Friendly Phishing is a company we've done some work with. We have no formal relationship with them, but what they do is they do something else. They train your staff on how to detect and watch out for these scams, especially around email. So Friendly Phishing is a business worth a call. The ACCC Scam Watch is really good to pay attention to. Sign up for their alerts and newsletters if you haven't. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has got a lot of stuff around data breaches and updates. Every now and again worth checking up, or if they've got a newsletter. ID Care or another, they've got fact sheets and videos about protecting your identity online. And that list goes on, and your IT team would be able to augment that list for you. If you don't have one, a couple of Google searches will reveal more resources. So those are just some. We've got another one I just wanted to flag, which is there's a podcast that's my colleague Eli Osherov, who really probably knows more about cybersecurity than I do. But there's Ellie doing an interview with Peter Price from Crime Stoppers, New South Wales chairman of Crime Stoppers, who's got a global perspective on the crime side of cybercrime. And I'd encourage all of you, if you can find some time, to give it a watch. So that's like a quadrant of solution, which is awareness and culture. The next one is about security hygiene. There's there's some very basic things which, if they're not in place, get them in place. It takes minutes. It just takes some discipline. They probably are in place in many cases, but there might be gaps. So it's always worth a quick audit of what's going on. Complex, longer passwords do make a difference. They're irritating, but they're effective. So I would do those. Absolutely use different passwords for different applications. And I know we're all guilty of that. So if it's Lion or Bob123 for your email, do not make that the same password as for any of your other apps in your personal or working lives. Have different passwords and have different longer passwords for different apps. I can't stress that enough, because what happens is, and we've seen this happen, when fraudsters crack a password for app 1, they will naturally extrapolate to app 2 or 3. The other piece is to make a password different by 1 or 2 digits or 1 or 2 letters is absolutely pointless. It can be done in nanoseconds, with software to just work out one sequence of passwords from another. And all this happens programmatically and mechanically. So, have different passwords. 2FA is hugely effective. Turn it on wherever and absolutely possible. There are very few apps that don't have it now. So please turn on your 2FA. And always, whether it's yourself or your IT department or colleagues, you need to be reviewing audit and access logs fairly regularly for unusual activity. So that's the second sort of weapon in the arsenal. The third one is policies and protocols. This is obviously a section in itself. I've spoken about callback controls. They need to be done hugely in a highly disciplined way. The real discipline is never to rely on incoming information. Part of our solution is a team who do callback controls in cases where people will not engage with a sort of a digital verification that we do. And in that case, we augment our callback controls with our team has a lot of IP sort of support where they can see where people are actually responding from or where the phone call is going to. So there's a lot of expertise around that. Another thing is to always restrict manage with discipline when staff join or leave. There are many examples. I've got one where I left a company that I worked for several years ago, and I think I can still log into some of those apps. Company will remain nameless, but you want, when people leave, to make sure they lose access. so staff leaving and changes. And of course, from an accounting discipline point of view, segregation of duties is critical, but it will not solve the problem. And then lastly, their tools. Now, I will say this emphatically. FTRA is one tool. It's a potent tool, but you need a stack. And there's virus and mail protection, which I'm sure you have, and you want to keep those upgraded. There's sort of front-end invoice recognition stuff. If you can afford that, I would do it. There's good vendor management solutions out there. But we're at the end, which is sort of real-time payment verification and vendor legitimacy management or verification. And I'm not here to sell, but I would like to talk about how we've solved this problem, because it speaks to where the world is moving to in terms of identity and verification. In the background are, I want to say, things like blockchain or distributed trust and distributed networks. I don't think we're there yet, but nevertheless, I'd like to talk conceptually about how we've solved the problem, because I think it's an interesting thing, and I'll try to get through this in about 7-8 minutes, and then we can stop and take a few questions. Earlier on, I said that the problem to solve is who's on the other side of the computer. It's a question of identity. And it's very hard to solve identity unilaterally in the world, for identity to be solved on a one-to-one basis. So how we've solved it is a phrase I will call collaborative cybersecurity, or you could substitute collaborative with crowd-based cybersecurity or communal cybersecurity. And those two words don't generally go together. But if you think about what emerging or not even emerging, like future technologies like the blockchain are going to do, is it's distributing trust from one to many, and you get a better chance of being right about things, to put it a bit sort of colloquially. So earlier on, I posed a question and I said, how do you create legitimacy, veracity, or security around a community of your suppliers, or any one business's suppliers, or in cybersecurity terms, a perimeter of defense? And as I've sort of alluded to in the previous slide, you need a village to do that. It takes a village. You need a community. And if that sounds a little weird or strange in the realm of payment controls and identity, and cybersecurity, well, we'll consider that you can solve it using that kind of approach in much the same way that TripAdvisor will create more certainty for you that you're going to the right hotel or the right restaurant, because there's a safety in numbers. It's one thing if a friend says, go to this Greek restaurant in Byron Bay, or whatever the case is. It's different when 18,000 people tell you it's a great restaurant. There's a greater chance of being correct. And some of you might remember in the early days of Google, before there was Google Maps, there was Waze in terms of telling you the best route home. And in the early days of Waze, they would actually crowdsource data from drivers. So I remember in the first few iterations of Waze, if you went past an accident, you'd press a button and it would alert Waze that there was an accident there. And if 100 drivers did it, well, there was more chance of there being an accident at that point. Since then, it's become satellite data and so forth. But nevertheless, it's multi kind of factors driving certainty. So we took that approach a few years ago, and we try to solve this problem. And we started with one company. It wasn't Monash Health. The identity of our first customer can remain private, but Monash Health were a later customer. But we started with one company, and we went out, and because there was no network or crowd or community to do the verification and embrace that approach, you have to start manually. I guess that's my point around Waze. So we started with two methods to verify all of Monash Health's suppliers. The one method was called BankLink, and that is, I would call it an open banking-esque solution. Two of our founders have worked in the banking software industry for 20 plus years, and they repurposed some mortgage origination software which extracts bank details for us. And for us, what happens is a vendor will log into their bank account, and instantly we can extract the details. And the other method we used, was a highly disciplined manual callback control with some technological support. And we went out and we verified all Monash Health as vendors. And then what happens is you can do the next company and the next company and the next company. So we went to Alfred, went to St. Vincent's, and so on, and you go deeper into the healthcare vertical. You then start crossing verticals, and we did construction and we did retail. You go into financial services and insurance and so on. But obviously, as all of you would start imagining, I don't need to say this, but if you're supplying surgical gloves to St. Vincent's in Melbourne, or Monash Health, or a healthcare network in the NT, you might also be supplying those same surgical gloves to another healthcare business. So what happens is in each sector, you start getting an economy of scale and verification, and you bring to bear what's really what our solution is built around, which is cross-matching data. And it's the most scalable form of verification. And if you knit that cross-match data into one network, you get a very interesting distributed way of verifying vendors, okay? So let's say, just to illustrate this example, let's say Caterpillar Moving Equipment supply diggers to both Laing O'Rourke and Meriton, or it's Coates Hire, pick your vendor, but let's just go with Coates Hire actually. And we verified the details, and I'm talking about the banking details for Coates Hire for Laing O'Rourke when they first joined our community or ecosystem. And then it turns out that Meriton are paying Coates Hire those same details. And when I say details, we've actually matched three things. We match BSB and account number to account name to what's sitting with the ABR, which is the ABN. So that's the third part of the match, the ABN, and the full trading name history of that business. And we make that match, and if that matches, we give a green thumb, okay, in our language, but a tick, a green thumb. Now, let's say another person joins this network, this FCHR trusted network, and let's say it's BuildCorp. They become a customer of ours and a member of our community. There are three things that are worth mentioning. The first thing is that we've probably verified 90% of all BuildCorp's suppliers already. Okay, so already their suppliers have been brought into the network, their identity's been verified, their bank account's been verified, and they're already covered off the bat. The second thing that happens is probably the more potent one for me, which is if BuildCorp are also paying Coates Hire at those same set of details, then the strength of our verification has gone up by 1. And in this two-dimensional example, it's gone from 2 to 3. But many of the vendors in our ecosystem, in the FCHR ecosystem, could have been verified hundreds and hundreds of times. And the strength of that green thumb gets 1 factor more powerful with each thing. Now, let me loop back to those business email compromise scams we were talking about a few moments ago, 20 minutes ago. Let's say a fraudster gets into Coates Hire's email system through whatever method, malware, phishing, doesn't matter, and they manipulate an invoice or impersonate the accounts receivable team at Coates Hire and send a message to Meriton, let's say, that says, we've changed bank account details. Let's say they even phone ahead and do it. If it gets through Meriton's controls and Meriton try pay that vendor at those manipulated details, the reason why this solution can pick it up, or this approach can pick it up, is because it'll mismatch what Laing O'Rourke and BuildCorp are paying at, and we can give it a red thumb. So what you're seeing there is the power of a crowdsourced solution or communal solution or distributed sort of a distributed set of trust or a multi-factor approach to verifying, in this case, bank account details. And where do we issue those alerts? Well, in your online banking live. And we can use that network to do a whole lot of other powerful things like verify tax status, ABN status, and so forth. But I'm really not here to sell, so I'm going to move quickly. But it is worth mentioning that what we can do is we can verify bank account details and tax legitimacy and business registration legitimacy, and we can do it in your online banking live, real time at any moment. Or if you had to upload a payment file to our solution, we've got a vendor management portal. You just upload it, and we can give you those same alerts that you just saw in the bank. Obviously, for this kind of approach to work, for this network to work, it needs to be big. Because otherwise everything is still on a one-to-one or manual basis. And we've managed to build this amazing database, this network, which now has 2.6 million verified businesses in it, and we monitor about $6 billion of payments a month. The other thing you can do with this network or with this solution is you can do something very unique, which is you can take the vendor master file or the supplier set of any business, and we can wash it and compare it to all the verified businesses in that network, and we can instantly give a dashboard or a read on the health of that vendor master file. And what we see is we ingest vendor master files into our solution that there's almost like pound for pound, like a 25% anomaly rate across most vendor master files. Some businesses have slightly dirtier vendor master files, some have sort of cleaner, but we see this 25%, and there's a kind of a distribution of anomalies there, from some really risky stuff, like a couple of percent will be just wrong bank accounts, to more benign things like lapsed business registration status. So nevertheless, that's kind of the FCHR solution, but I'm not going to spend more time on that. We've got an amazing sort of vendor management piece that works off that, where you can add or change vendors legitimately and digitally. And that's kind of what we do at FCHR, and it's found a home in 700 businesses across Australia, from some very big ones like, you know, South 32 Mining, NBN Co, BlueScope Steel, all the way to about 120 schools across the country. So, you know, these businesses have embraced this collaborative approach to cybersecurity. So thank you for your time. Hopefully everyone's got a bit out of this. There are a whole lot of other resources you can embrace. But what I'd like to do is, as Nick said, just turn on the camera and move to Q&A. So thank you very much for your time. We will be publishing a recording of this webinar. So hopefully you didn't have to take notes. Nick, not sure if there are any questions that have been popped in.
Not yet. So if you find the question tab in the portal, you can pop in any question regarding the content. We're happy to take some. I do apologize for the technical problems we had at the beginning of this session. I hope that most of you that are still here were able to retrieve sound again. So apologies for that. Also, I realized the word callback controls has come up a few times. We do have a very handy one-pager that anybody in the AP team can use, where the basic tips and procedures are listed on. Several of our customers still have that next to their desk, so I'll make sure that I'll send it along with the recordings as well. You can just use that to your own liking, or yeah. So Michelle, not really a question. She said, great presentation, Gavin. So
with pleasure. We'll do more of these this year with new topics.
Yeah, and Louise is asking whether this solution also works for New Zealand suppliers.
We do have 1 or 2 customers in New Zealand. We will put them through our vendor verification process. Just sorry, our customer in New Zealand is Hannah Shoes, I think. I might have pronounced it incorrectly. We're still spooling up the database of New Zealand suppliers, so there's not the cross-matching component, but we can certainly use all the other methods of verification and improve your controls from wherever they were at. So long story short, yes, but we're still spooling up the database, and we can certainly get in touch with you, Louise.
Okay, and then another question from Andrew just came in. What happens when a fake bank account is set up with multiple suppliers that are in your reviewed network?
Sorry, a customer bank account, or
so
we're not customer bank accounts. But I will say this, sorry, Andrew. What I will say this is, and I didn't get stuck into it because just avoiding a product demo. There's a huge amount of algorithmic sort of operation sitting across the top of that database, which looks at things like volume of payments per supplier, recency. It looks at the recency of which a supplier was set up and entered to the network. So there are a few guardrails, because what you're talking about is can someone game that approach or that database? Can they game it by setting up a supplier, getting payments to that supplier? No form of cybersecurity is completely perfect, but it is very hard to game our database, because we would see a lot of other information about volume, recency, frequency of payment to that business if it was set up for the purposes of fraud. So I don't know if I've exactly answered your question, but that's what I would say.
And then I got another one from Jeff. I think this might be the crux of the product. What are the banks doing to protect their customers, and what should we do if they are doing nothing?
Well, I mean, the commercial, if I put a commercial hat on, I'd go improve your own controls and use vendors like us to take them from, you know, there's certain systems, there's certain approaches, practices you can take to get your controls up. So whether it's more disciplined callback controls, segregation of duties, vendor management, they're all things you can do to lift it. And then if I put my commercial hat on, systems like ours do close that gap for the banks, which is, you know, why we've grown so fast. and that will improve it. That's what you can do. What are the banks doing? Well, over time, the banks are looking at something called the new payments platform, which has various components to it. You might read about it in the press. As recently as 2 weeks ago, there's a lot of press about who was lobbying who, Nick, but I think the ACCC lobbying the banks to sort of put something in place. The challenge for the banks is a couple of fold. That the roadmap they would follow is probably the UK's one. Pay UK is the body set up in the UK, which implemented something called confirmation of payee. You can certainly Google that. And what confirmation of payee does is it tries to make that match, okay? There are a couple of limitations to confirmation of payee, which is why payments fraud is still up 7% post implementation of COP in the UK. And what those limitations are as follows. The first limitation is it's got to work with all the ERP systems, and that implementing it is a nightmare because you've got to go across every business, every ERP. But let's say that box is ticked. The next problem is really the fact that the data that's sitting in the banks is often not that compatible with your vendor payments data, because they've truncated bank accounts due to the limitations of the banking backend software. So you get abbreviated account names. You get, it can't handle trust accounts, it can't handle single vendor accounts. So what happens is, and that's just within one bank, then you try and match it to the details within another bank, assuming customer and supplier are across two different banks, and you get a mismatch. Okay, so it often mismatches. Then you add to it something else in the UK regime called contingent liability, which says if the banks do this, well, if they get it wrong, then they are liable. So what the banks have done in the UK is they've almost built in too much sensitivity to the system, and you get a huge volume of false positives. Now, look, my answer is arguably a bit self-serving there. The banks can improve things. We would argue that it needs to be a public kind of private partnership with the banks, with companies like ours and others. The banks themselves are not going to be the most fluid solution. They are looking at things, but they're reluctant to take on liability or change things, quite frankly.
Yeah. So I'm mindful of time, and there's a few questions that I think will.
Well, I think we can do one more, Nick. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there are still a few questions there that I think are better addressed in a
Sure.
demo. It might take a bit longer. So if you don't get to your question, please contact us. I think some of these questions are really good, but they take quite some time to answer. So it might be better to just schedule a demonstration with our team.
Yeah.
And then a good question from Mary. She's interested to learn more about like cyber insurance and what our take on that is.
So our take is have it, and we do have some, so get it. A couple of things just to check, which is what tends to happen is, cyber insurance obviously after the fact, right? So you're being remediated after you've lost the money. And as I said earlier, conservatively, the loss is probably a 3 to 4x on the actual funds lost. So cyber insurance will not remediate your reputational damage, system downtime, legal costs, and so forth. Okay, but have it. Okay. We do have some instances where cyber insurance premiums have been lowered because our product's been implemented. That's not an across the board answer, so that would exist between you and your insurer. And the third thing to look at with cyber insurance premiums and having it is what exactly does it cover? Because a lot of these scams are not cyber digital infrastructural attacks like a data breach. They're psychological manipulations of someone on your AP team. So some cyber insurance providers will not cover things like payment diversion scams or business email compromise. So Mary, 3 things: read the fine print, don't rely on it alone as a solution, and 3, if you did have to employ a solution like ours or others, maybe a chat with your insurer as to whether premiums will be lowered.
Yeah, and just to add on that, like 2 weeks ago, we wrote an article about this. It's published on our blog, and it's a case study of a business that's trying to retrieve their money, and there's a whole problem around who is liable and where, and was this actually covered in the policy. So there's a lot of ambiguity around how the covers work. So yeah, I'd invite you, if you want to read more about that as well, then I'd invite you to our blog. I think that's it. Sorry if we didn't answer all your questions. Just mindful of time. If you still have questions, if you want to learn more about the platform, I'm sorry, Gavin, you didn't do any of the selling. I feel I have to.
You're killing us.
If you still have questions about the platform or anything like that, please don't hesitate to request a demonstration with our team. They'll be very happy to explain how the solution will fit into your business and how it will mitigate the risks of these financial frauds. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your time and have a great day and be safe for if you are in any of the flooding areas. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Is it over?